Hi, everyone. I'm Vanessa Fuqua, this year's Training VP, and I am so excited that you're here. Before we get started, I want to cover some housekeeping items. First, we recommend that you put your settings in speaker mode so you will be able to see our speaker and our slides. Also, for meeting credit, you must be registered on jld.net, be present within the first 15 minutes of start time, and stay until the end of the scheduled time. At the end of the meeting, you should complete the survey that you received in your email. The survey will also be shared in the chat and on the screen at the end of this meeting. Please use your full name in your settings, and if you are dialing in, please email education@jld.net with your name and the phone number you are using to receive credit. Our learning objectives this evening are: have a better understanding of the aspects of the JLD D&I action plan, learn how to transcend from allyship to accountability via personal education, and learn steps to build your own personal racial equity plan. I want to touch on our diversity and inclusion action plan for the year. I also want to note that although our summer series has had a targeted focus on racial injustice, the League is still committed to focusing on a variety of topics related to diversity, equity, and inclusion to serve our members and our community. Our summer series comes to a close tonight. We will be sharing personal study resources on our website, which will include things to read, listen to, and watch. We're also creating focus groups where you can share ideas on what you think is needed for us to be more diverse and inclusive for our members and for our community. In addition, we are working to update internal training materials, such as our cultural competency document, as well as offering additional training for our members, staff, board, and leadership council. We will continue to keep you updated on what's to come as we roll out updates. Should you have any questions tonight related to the action plan or specific to JLD, please send a chat to either JLD questions or meeting credit questions. Should you have questions for our speaker, please type your question to speaker questions. Finally, I want to give a personal thank you to the Education Committee, the D&I Committee, and all of the strategy team for their partnership in executing this valuable and much needed training. I'm incredibly grateful for you and your efforts. Thank you for your dedication to the League. With that, I'd like to hand it off to Kim from our D&I team to introduce our speaker, Robin.
Good evening, everyone. I just want to welcome everybody into our session tonight and to acknowledge that today may have been a tough day for some of us with the ceremony for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Breonna Taylor verdict. And so I just invite everybody to exercise some self-care and compassion as we go through kind of these tough times as a community. So my name is Kimberly Mans, and I am the founder of an organization called H3 Diversity, which is dedicated to bringing diverse populations together to explore the head, heart, and hands of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm a Dallas native and third-year Junior League member. Went to Ursuline Academy for those of you, if there's anybody from Ursuline in the house. In my experience growing up in Dallas, it was really what rooted me in working through issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The Junior League is a particularly passionate place for me to explore issues of DEI because this might be my own unconscious bias, but I do believe that women are in the center of the solutions for the challenges that we are seeking both here locally in Dallas and across the nation. It's my distinct honor to introduce Dr. Robin Short, who is the founder and president of Workplace Peace Institute, a consulting and research firm that brings peace and dignity to the workplace. She also works as a peace builder, trainer, mediator, racial equity coach, and restorative justice facilitator. Dr. Short is the founder and the board chair of the Peace and Conciliation Project, a 501c3 anti-racism organization that brings communities together to address and repair the harm of racial injustice. She works with the Dallas Truth Racial Healing and Transformation as a racial equity coach for nonprofit organizations. Dr. Short is an adjunct professor at SMU in the Masters of Conflict Management and Dispute Resolution program and the Masters of Leadership and Negotiation at Bay Path University. Dr. Short has authored 4 books on peace building. Robin is going to share a little bit about her own story and racial equity, and share a framework for how you can define what your unique role in anti-racism and racial equity is. So as she's talking, as we said, make sure to put questions in the chat, and I will help facilitate questions that come up, particularly questions that are common as she gives her presentation. So with that, Robin, I'll kick it over to you to share a bit about your own personal journey. Thank you.
I needed to unmute myself. I want to talk to you today about a little bit about the difference between allyship and personal responsibility. When we should show up as good and effective allies, and when we need to actually assume responsibility for ourselves. Assume responsibility ourselves for this work of dismantling racism. Before we get started, I would like to do a land and people acknowledgement. Dallas is on stolen land and was built by stolen people. And I think it's important for those of us who live, work, and call Dallas home that we have a transparent and honest understanding of the history of our city. I think there's no better love that you can give something than to improve upon it. And in order to improve upon something, we need to be honest about where we're from. And in this presentation, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about where I'm from and the development of my own personal narrative and how it has shaped my work in anti-racism and as an ally. So to get started, I want to talk a little bit about the difference between allyship and responsibility and accountability. So an ally is a person or organization that cooperates with or helps another in a particular activity. Being accountable is the state of being responsible for the particular activity. So allyship is a support role, with the implication being that this is someone else's problem, and being accountable requires taking responsibility for the problem and therefore the solution. So when is allyship appropriate? There's a couple of examples that I can share that I think are really great examples of when white people should be showing up as allies. One is if you are the type of person who likes to go and walk and march and do protest, marching with your Black brothers and sisters in Black Lives Matter protest is an effective way to show up as an ally. There was an event this summer after George Floyd's murder and the protests that were going on. There was an event at the Freedman Cemetery where the Black community was coming together to honor all of those whose lives had been taken by law enforcement. And the ceremony was specifically for a healing space for Black lives and for the Black community. They invited white allies to show up, to bring water, to bring medical supplies, and to bring other supplies that were important elements of having safe and effective marches. They also invited allies to show up and create a pillar of support and to hold space while the ceremony was going on. So that was a really appropriate way to show up as an ally and to be a support person in that work. Other ways that you might choose to be an ally and have opportunities for allyship is in your workplaces and in your social settings. When you see people of color being treated differently or being treated with racism, and to step and to say something and to forge through the uncomfortableness and the politeness that white people are so conditioned to preserve. A colleague of mine was sharing a story about someone in the workplace commenting on a new way that she was wearing her hair. I believe, if I remember correctly, this story is she had come to work wearing her hair, and a white colleague reached over and began to touch her hair and commented on how beautiful it was. She pulled back because it was awkward and inappropriate, and it startled the woman who began to touch her. And a white colleague said, Why are you touching her hair? Would you ever reach over and touch my hair? So that was a really effective way to show up as an ally. But as you can see, allyship is not going to dismantle racism. It isn't going to create any kind of institutional or structural change in America. What it does is it lends support. And that support is really important, but it's not going to get the job done. So when we're thinking about this work of white people engaging in allyship and white people engaging and taking personal responsibility for dismantling racism, it's imperative that we first do no harm. And it is very much white culture, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, it's very much white cultural norms to jump in with the sense of urgency and to quote unquote build the plane while we're flying it. To think that we're coming with all of the solutions and to know how to solve problems that we really actually don't have any understanding or education in. So before really intensely moving in to take personal responsibility, we need to become deeply educated about racism, about the lived experiences of people of color, about the different lived experiences of people of color, and we also need to have a deep understanding of our own whiteness. And I think that understanding and exploration and education around whiteness is a critical piece that's often missed in the work that white people do. So yes, we absolutely need to understand the lived experiences of Black and Indigenous people of color and Latinx people. And we need to fully understand these lived experiences within the context of our own whiteness and white culture. I was listening to an Audible book recently, and the person who was writing the book, I think it was called Waking Up to Whiteness. And he made a Black friend of his, I wish that white people had culture. And the guy kind of stopped and he said, white culture is everywhere. It's so pervasive that you can't see it. And if you can't see something, you can't engage with it effectively. So part of this work of taking responsibility and personal accountability is to become really deeply educated in our own whiteness. A great place to start, and I would call this a primer, is a memoir by a woman by the name of Debbie Irving called Waking Up White. And it's her story of all of the assumptions that she made, all the false narratives that she carried with her, all of the ways in which she lived with privilege and was unaware of her privilege. And I, as a white person, there were many things about this book that I related to. And I think that every white person in America will see parts of themselves in her story. It's a wonderful place to begin the work. White Fragility is also a really important place to start the work. There's a great book called The Good White Racist, which is a great place to start. A book called White Rage, which is also a really great book. But as much as you are learning about the lived experiences of people of color, you need to be equally spending that amount of time examining your own whiteness. Or you may likely unintentionally do harm. An analogy that I like to use is if I have an emergency and I call for a paramedic to show up, I need a paramedic that is more than well-intended. I need a paramedic that's deeply educated and also well-intended. The well-intended paramedic might kill me. And so is the case with white people doing anti-racist work. Without that education piece, we will do harm. It's not that we might do harm, we will unintentionally do harm. So I want to spend just a few minutes on white cultural norms. These are norms that are so pervasive to white culture that it's just the way we live, it's the way we operate. It's not something that we're really aware of until I think it's brought to our attention. And having done work in other countries, I have experienced very much that this is white cultural norm, that this isn't human norm. It's really specific to Western and European or European influenced cultures. So there is, in white culture, there is a deep sense of urgency. We tend to focus on the task before we would focus on the relationship. Results are prioritized over process, and outcomes are more important than inclusion. There typically is little space for mistakes and learning, and quantity is valued over quality. I teach at several universities, and dialogue is an important part of my pedagogy and the way that I teach. And I invite spaces for people to share their lived experiences. And without exception, every university that I have every class I've ever taught in, and unless you are teaching in a historically Black college, you're probably teaching in a predominantly white space. And every class I have ever taught, a few students who are always white students, talk about the kind of irritation that they have with how long some stories take. And that's this sense of urgency, that we should be focusing on content before we focus on the relationship building, that we should be focusing on the process and the outcomes of what I'm supposed to get in this class over the relationship building. And the relationship piece is really critical. Part of white cultural norms is this tendency to be conflict avoidant and very defensive. You learned about this as you read through White Fragility, this defensiveness that white people experience typically around being challenged with ideas that either make them confront their identity or confront their understanding of the world. Different or difficult ideas can be considered threatening. White privilege is a thing. That is a thing that of white people feel really uncomfortable because it's considered a threatening idea instead of curious about that. Protecting certain people's feelings. So I will say that I see this a lot in the work that I do, especially as it relates to racial equity and nonprofit work. The higher up you go in most organizations, the wider that is. And we are trying to move racial equity work through an organization, people begin trying to language the work differently the higher up the communication goes in the hierarchy. So this idea that we're trying to protect certain people's feelings over others is very present in workplace organizations that are deeply, intensely hierarchical. There tends to be no space for feelings. We often hear, especially, well, this is actually pervasive. I was going to say in the workplace, we often hear, that we should just leave our feelings out of it. This is really just all about business. But I think that I think about the family dinners and family holidays and the way we as white people are really conditioned to bifurcate ourselves and to not be emotive and expressive with our feelings, largely because we are trying to protect the feelings of other and maintain this sense of politeness and comfort. And this idea that the control of agenda is also something that's deeply baked into white cultural norms. Paternalism is something that we see that's very pervasive in nonprofit work. This idea that those people who hold power and ability to be influential in an organization are the people who have control. There's this sense of we're helping them, whoever they are. There's a sense of power hoarding and a tendency to be a savior complex. So this white person coming into someone else's space and offering all of the solutions without really inviting the dialogue and expertise that's inherent in those lived experience. And this paternalism is something that you'll see a lot being explored in Debbie Irving's book, Waking Up White, that I hope you'll all take a look at. And then objectivity, and really it's the lack of objectivity. So either or thinking, a focus of rules over experience, deep prioritization of the written word. In other cultures, I'm thinking specifically around African cultures, narrative storytelling and the narrative history is highly prioritized, and being the person who is honored with that role, I think it's called a griot, is the person who's honored with the role of being the narrative historian, is a deeply prestigious role. And in white culture, if it's not written down, it's just not true. And as you get really deep into this work, you may begin to see how how there's a lack of validating people's lived experiences because it wasn't documented in a way that white people can prioritize. And then there's also some suspicions of alternatives. So I want you to have this information as something to be reflective on as you move through your world, and to be thinking about as you engage in this work of anti-racism. So what I always hear, and what my colleagues always hear, and what I'm going to imagine a lot of the Black women on this call always hear, is the question, what can I do? And this question is meant with good intentions, but it actually implies powerlessness, and it shifts the burden of solving the problem on the injured party. And it kind of relieves the person asking the question of any responsibility. What we as white people should be asking is, what will I do? And that question assumes ownership of our own power, also taking responsibility for repairing harm and creating change. And as we go through this framework of how you can build your own personal racial equity plan, what you will begin to see is how ineffective that question, what can I do, is. Because you are actually the only person who holds the answer. The person that you are asking that to does not know you well enough to be able to answer the question for you. So let's take a look at that. This is a quote that I think is really powerful, and it's something that has really shaped my life. Each of us has a unique part to play in the healing of the world. And if we assume that that is true, if we're willing to operate from this perspective, that each of us has a unique part to play in the healing of the world, then we'll realize that that question, what will I do, is the beginning point of how we find that space. So we each come to racial equity work with our own identity, our own passions, our own skills, and our own personal and professional network. And those four things all intersect to really create the unique contribution, the unique way that you as a single individual can go about healing the world, especially as it relates to racial equity. So I want to spend a little bit of time unpacking this framework and what each of these elements are. And I also want to let you know that I shared with the diversity and inclusion team a worksheet that kind of lays this out for you. So you should have access to that if it's something that you want to take after this and really spend some time reflecting on. So I'm going to share my story with you as we go through this framework, as a way of helping you begin to explore your own story. We're all situated in this work differently, and that will inform how we approach it. Our ancestors are all calling on each of us in a very unique way. I believe very deeply, and this is a spiritual belief, so you can do what you want with it, but I believe that we carry both the richness, the rewards, the hard work, and the responsibilities of our ancestors. So there is accumulated education, there's accumulated wealth, there's accumulated knowledge, there is a passing on of identity, but also what comes with that is responsibility for the harm that our ancestors did. That is a personal belief that guides my work. Our families of origin have shaped our responsibilities really differently. Our lived experiences inform how we engage in racial equity. Nobody has lived the life that you have lived. People have lived similar lives, but nobody has lived your life. And that is going to really shape how you come to this work in a very specific way. And the values that shape our life will also shape our racial equity work. So when I think about who I am a white woman of British and Irish descent, and my ancestors here in the United States were from the Deep South. I don't think at any point in my ancestral history has anyone moved out of the Deep South. Texas is as far west as we've gone, and Tennessee is probably as far north as we've gone. My grandfather was a member of the KKK. This is a narrative that I have only this year begun to tell, because clearly it's not something that I have any amount of pride in. It's something that I have a lot of shame in. But for those of you who were here for Jerry Hawkins' presentation, what you might have heard is that if your grandfather was from Dallas, there is a 1 in 3 chance that he was also a member of the KKK. In the 1920s, Dallas was the biggest Ku Klux Klan membership in the entire world. So this is a history that those of us who are from Dallas are going to have to reckon with. I grew up in a segregated city here in Dallas as a daughter of a police officer. All of that shaped the way I chose to live my life. I'm a researcher, I'm a writer, I'm a teacher, I'm a mediator, I'm a peace builder, I'm a restorative justice facilitator, I'm a consultant and a book publisher. And all of that is integrated. I can't separate any of it. But I know that the way that I evolved and emerged as an adult was deeply influenced by my childhood and my ancestors. And that is the same for you as well. We all have different passions, and our individual passions fuel our life purpose, and our individual passions should fuel our racial equity work, because where we're passionate is where we will give our time. We each feel a particular sense of intensity about a particular aspect of the human experience. I know for me personally, something is really calling on me when my body begins to respond to it. My heart starts pounding, my hands get clammy. I physiologically respond to those things that I'm passionate about. We each feel called to engage in a particular aspect of social life. So if you're a parent, that might be something that's calling you in terms of racial equity work and the way that you want to advocate for young people. Your professional life, however, we all have different passions that are going to influence the way that we engage in racial equity work. And we're all drawing from different internal motivators. So it might be spiritualistic, it might be humanistic, it might be religious, but there is an internal motivator that each of us have that's pulling us forward into this work. So I personally am passionate. I believe all people have an inherent right to human security and dignity, and I'm passionate about the human capacity to heal and transform. I feel particularly passionate about racial disparities in criminal justice and racial disparities in the workplace. And those two passions are really informed by much of my identity. And so I invite you to spend time reflecting on this element of the framework to help inform the way that you'll show up in racial equity work. We all have different skills. So we each have a unique set of skills that paired with our individual identities and passions uniquely prepare us for racial equity work. Your combination of skills uniquely prepare you for engaging in racial equity work, and your unique combination of skills will inform where and how you are uniquely qualified to engage in racial equity work. So for myself, I'm a skilled conflict engager. I'm trained to see and understand underlying interest. So I can hear two people talking and they might be saying different things, but I hear what they're both saying, even if it's not coming out through their words. I'm a skilled dialogue facilitator. I have strong writing skills, negotiation skills, listening skills. I'm comfortable with risk. I have strong business acumen. I understand systems design, and I understand human behavior in that context. I'm charismatic and skilled in bringing people into causes I'm passionate about. So you can see my skills are really beginning to hone where I can be effective in this work. My skills are really unique to me. Your skills are really unique to you. And if you sit down and you spend time bullet pointing all of the things you're really skilled at, and maybe some areas where you want to build skill, you're going to begin to, this picture of who you are will emerge that is no other person has these things. No other person has your identity. No other person has your passions. No other person has your skills. This lane of contribution is beginning to narrow. And then lastly, we all have different access to different networks. Over the course of our lifetime, each of us has cultivated professional and personal networks where we have influence and where we can draw on for resources. So you need to be thinking about in this work, what resources are you specifically capable of gathering? Some of you may be judges, some of you may be lawyers, some of you may be legislators. Some of you may have good friends who are all of those folks. Some of you may be friends with law enforcement. You may be law enforcement. So we all have vast network of personal and professional, that is personal and professional, that we can pull into this work with us. So what networks are you able to mobilize? For me, I have an access to myriad networks that include mediation professionals, organization development professionals, academics, writers, social justice activists, marketing professionals, artists and designers, governmental leaders, political leaders, as well as my professional networks of my husband and his family. So when you begin to really chart out who are all of the people and their networks that I can mobilize behind my work, you have now figured out the lane that you can operate in. And it is a lane that really belongs specifically to you. Nobody has this combination of characteristics. So you can see how question, what can I do? Nobody can answer that question for you. You are absolutely the only person who can answer the question. And that lane that you're operating in is going to evolve and change as you evolve and change throughout your work. So I began my journey probably around 2006. And every year I have more influence. So I'm going to call that power. I have access to more tables, access to more decision-making, access to more people, access to more resources. My identity, passion isn't changing. My skills are growing and my network is growing. But the lane that I'm operating in is just getting more effective. So I invite you all to really dig into this. You have a framework, you have a worksheet that you can work with. If you really want to dive into it, I'm going to start a webinar series that will go over through the course of 6 weeks. And people can go through that webinar series as a cohort, which I think is a really powerful way to dig into this work when you have access to other people's brains to kind of bounce ideas off of. But so with that, I'd like to turn it over for discussion and answer any questions that you might have.
Hey, Robin, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. For a second, my volume wasn't working, so I'm glad that we got that fixed. But I really appreciate the framework that you brought forward, because I think right now a lot of folks are getting kind of checklists of like, this is what it means to be anti-racist, and what you're bringing to bear is that it really has to come from your soul, kind of, because we're trying to create something new, and for us to actually create kind of a new world and a new environment, each of us has to decide how we're uniquely going to contribute to it. So I loved what you shared. And so there was a question about defensiveness. And so a question around, if my loved one is saying, has mentality, I'm sick of being attacked for being white, I'm a good person, what do you suggest to somebody to discuss that with them?
You know, I was thinking about that question actually this morning. And I have been thinking about kind of narratives that we've grown up with. And I can in no way speak for all Black people, so I'm only going to speak about the stories that my Black friends have told me. But there is a narrative around that I have heard from my Black friends about growing up and being told by their parents, like, you know, we have these messages that our parents tell us all the time, and be strong was this really important message that was always delivered. That was not delivered in my white world. What was delivered in my white world almost every single day was be good. And this is an actual quote: be good, be kind, be Christian. And be Christian specifically in this context meant was be obedient, be lovely, be easy to be around. And so, and I see some head nodding. I think white people, especially white women, and by the way, shout out Kim, I agree, it's women that are going to get this done. I'm real comfortable with that bias.
Absolutely.
But white women have been conditioned to be good. And white men have been conditioned that they are good, which is a different message. We are in a continuous sense of striving for goodness. They're in a continuous sense of, I am good. So what is happening is a huge identity assault. And what's happening in the brain so what's fascinating about the way the brain works is our brain is designed to do it's designed for survival. That is the number one function of the brain. And it does that in two ways: by fleeing from harm and by connecting with people. Anti-racism work, racial equity work, is the work of connecting. But when we are told that we are doing things that harm people, it is a massive violation of the narrative we've been swimming in our whole entire life. So our brain goes off and says, you're not safe, run. You're not safe, fight back. You're not safe, freeze. And what we need to do in this work, and I'm speaking specifically to the white folks here, what we need to do in this work is, one, absorb what we're hearing and accept it as truth. In the same exact way that I believe women when they say they've been assaulted, I believe people of color when they say what you did was harmful. Believe them. And if your brain fires off, I'm not safe, I need to fight, I need to flee, then literally just walk away. There's all sorts of things that you can do to begin to like bring your brain down and recondition yourself that being good is actually listening, hearing, learning, and changing. And it's exhausting. And we've been running around for 400 years, never having to do the emotional labor of this work. And every person of color in America has been walking around for 400 years carrying all the emotional labor. And so when I have an identity kind of like, whoa, something just happened, and here I am, this good white lady, and my body just like feels all this shame, I sit with that and I think, God, imagine feeling this every day and having to go to work. Imagine feeling this every day and having to raise your children. Imagine feeling this every day and having to get out of bed. I can get through today. So those are the stories that white people need to be having with white people and encouraging white people. And here's the thing too. I think we need to find our white friend who's doing this work with us, where we can call up and say, I need to just have some white fragility for a minute. Like, I need to get this out of my system with a white person and move on. Do not do that to your friends of color, but find a white person who's doing the work. Don't find a white person who's not doing the work, because they're going to say all the things you don't need to hear, right? Like, you don't need to deal with that. You're a good person, da 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 da. Find a person that can hold it with you and then hold you accountable and then get you back on your feet and moving forward.
Absolutely. That's an awesome answer. I'm seeing a lot of kind of snaps in the chat to that. And I think what you brought up is something that we as human beings in general, we all are conditioned to fight or flight. So when you see somebody actually going through it, at least you know what's happening, because all of us at some point have to go through that. We have a question. I appreciate you kind of being vulnerable and talking about your own experience, particularly here in Dallas. It's one of the most segregated cities in the nation. And so if you grew up here, you most likely were socialized in a way that does not support anti-racism. And so there was a question about, can you go a little bit deeper into your ancestry and the influence it's had on you, and how you've been able to then shift from that kind of socialized identity to the anti-racism work?
Sure. So I think you have, there's probably three kinds of races, but I'm gonna leave the actual KKK out of this. So you have the racists that like use racist language, say racist things. And then you have the racist who or what most of us are, right? We're being polite, we're avoiding conflict. We know people of color that we work with, but we aren't really doing the work, right? We're good people. I was raised by that middle group, like my dad wasn't in the KKK, but my dad was a racist. That language was used. It was racist things were said. I was raised in a racist family that was openly racist. And for reasons I don't really understand, it never rubbed off. Like from the very beginning, I saw it as wrong and inaccurate and unfair. And I recognized from the earliest age that I can remember that my life was better, safer, and easier because I was white, and even because I was straight. Like for some reason, by the age of 7, I was able to internalize, even though I didn't have the language, that I was in a population of people that things were just easier for, and I didn't do anything to earn it. And my dad was a police officer, and everybody was law enforcement in my family. And my grandparents were openly racist. It was just really blatant. And to answer kind of what shaped that was, I just knew it wasn't fair. And I carried shame about that. And I think that there are a couple of ways of thinking about shame. So shame can happen when we kind of have an identity assault, right? We're just swimming in that awful feeling, that toxic feeling of shame. I think we have to be super intentional about making that feeling a learning feeling, right? Where we go, here's this experience that I'm having, and I need to be intentional about what I'm going to do with it and learn. And then there is a sense of shame that is more around responsibility. So a couple of years ago, I had an opportunity to participate in a group of women at SMU who were doing a research cluster called Women of Color Sharing Our Narratives, or Women of Color Telling Our Narratives. And Dr. Candace Bledsoe, who is a Black academic at SMU, is leading that. And she invited me to participate in this, which was a real honor for me to be the only white woman in that room hearing these stories. And every single woman without exception started their story with, here's my name and here's the story of my ancestors. And they went from their ancestors and they brought us forward. And as I kept hearing this over and over again, I thought, I don't know a white person who does that. I have never heard this format of storytelling in white spaces. So I began to really reflect on what's up with that. And the story, the answer is that there is a lot of shame that is embedded in us as white people. And I think we need to really lean into that and accept it and take responsibility for it, because otherwise we're just going to pass it on to our children and they're going to carry it with them. So what knowing the story of my family did for me and growing up in that environment was, I had this internal radar that was constantly saying, that's not true. It's just not true. And eventually I took that it's not true and I'm going to do something about that.
Yeah, that's awesome. I know that's a very hard conclusion to come to, particularly as a child, when the people that are looking after you and care for you the most are contradicting what you know to be true. So I know that's a tough thing to kind of overcome.
And just real quickly to add to that, Kim, there was a part of me that never fully trusted them.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I think a lot of us have that, and it's hard to follow that intuition. There's a question here about the phrase white people in general, that it's historically used to gloss over European conflict. Basically, that race is a social and political construct that was created to have a black and white division. And so can you comment on the history and evolution of the American concept of white people?
Okay, so I'm not a historian, so I'm going to kind of high level about this. Do y'all hear that feedback?
That's fine.
Okay. So my understanding is that the concept of white people really emerged on the continent of the United States when people of European descent came here and began the practice of enslaving people from Africa. there was, this is my understanding, that there was a differentiation that was born out of racism, and that racism was really born out of slavery. So racism didn't cause slavery, slavery caused racism. If I'm going to do this horrible thing, kidnap people, take them from their homes, enslave them, and torture them, I now have to build a narrative that I'm better in order to live with myself for doing that. And so racism was born out of that construct. And then whiteness was born out of the juxtaposition of differing yourself from Black people, who you're now better than because of this narrative that you've created. So yes, race is a social construct. Race is something that is not real in any scientific fact, but it is 100% real in people's lived experiences. In this work, I use the nomenclature of ethnic origin. I just don't talk about race because it isn't real. And by talking about it continuously makes it real. And ethnic origin speaks specifically to the culture and language and social norms that have informed groups of people. That is real. That is a real thing. But we talk about white people, and we talk about Black people, and we talk about Latinx people, because those are the social constructs that are informing the lived experiences of each of us. So until it really disappears, it's not scientifically true, but it's true in practice.
Absolutely. So there's no actual biological basis for race. Like there's not actual biological differences between us as human beings that are based on features that was basically created to create a hierarchy of human value and justify slavery. So I think that's important for folks to understand that race is actually something that doesn't actually exist. So a question, oh, go ahead.
I want to jump in real quickly to kind of add on to that. So language is fluid and it's always evolving, and it's evolving in a lot of ways around honoring of identity, and people. Language evolves as people reclaim elements of their identity. So when I say Black people, I am specifically referring to Black American descendants of enslaved people. When I say African American, I am specifically referring to African immigrants or descendants of African immigrants. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that I'm not actually speaking of color when I say Black people, I'm speaking about identity. And in the United States, white has become an identity.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I think there's a good question here about how do you suggest we deal with the bad news cycle fatigue? And so my assumption is that we have so much happening in the media right now. It's tough. I started out the conversation talking about kind of the news that we got today, and it seems like every day we're getting more and more bad news and fatigue around that. So all of us are having to exercise more self-care. So what is your suggestion around that?
As it relates to racial injustice and police brutality and systemic racism, nothing is happening today that hasn't been happening for 400 years. What is different about today is that it's being recorded by people on their cell phones, and that social media exists and we all see it. So for the vast majority of American history, all of this was happening, and if you weren't present to it or didn't hear about it through the grapevine, you really didn't know it was happening. And so I say that to say Black people have known for 400 years that it was happening. So the exhaustion and the fatigue and the overwhelming sadness and grief that we as white people are experiencing as we're witnessing this is every day in America for Black people. So lean into it. Don't exercise the privilege of walking away and ignoring it. Lean into it and be with it. And do what you can from a self-care perspective. And I will say nothing, uh, if we exercise our power to be engaged in change, it will have a direct correlation to how we feel about what we're seeing. Um, the, the, the sense of powerlessness that can come with inaction makes the observation of what's happening that much worse. But knowing that there is a space that you are being really active in working toward creating change in that space, I think is a really effective way to deal with the trauma. And also, we have to, we do have to, for me, I can only handle so much, right? So I'm going to choose to lean into the racial justice work, and I'm going to tune out some of the noise about what's happening in Congress, because I can't hold all of it. And folks in Congress aren't dying, and Black people are. So I'm going to really focus on that conflict. So I think it is choosing where you're going to focus your energy. So if we think about all of the oppression that happens inside this massive, monstrous structure of systemic racism, none of us are going to be able to tackle the whole thing. So by using that framework and finding the space you're going to be active in, and then giving 150% to that space, will help you feel like you have some power in the situation. And I think will help you deal with the trauma and the grief. But I think there's also just some importance of accepting the trauma and the grief, and holding that with your friends of color, so that they're not having to hold it alone.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up. I mean, there is such a thing as racial trauma, and you're right. Black people have just been enduring it for centuries. It affects kind of your mental health. It affects your physical health, and so there is a fatigue that's going on, particularly among communities of color. And so that's the reason why we try to make sure that you give your Black friends some reprieve right now, because you can actually experience these secondary trauma as if it's happening to you or one of your family members. And so it hurts just as bad. I know I've had those experiences in watching what's happening lately with George Floyd. And so I just want folks to acknowledge how real it is in experiencing these, particularly if you can connect with a person and see that that could have been my brother or somebody related to me.
A friend of mine told me the other day that, well, they're both my friends. The husband and the wife are both my friends. So he had a nightmare. They're Black. He had a nightmare that the police had barged into his house and with guns and were about to shoot him and his wife while they were in bed. The dream was him being exactly where he was, in bed with his wife, and in his sleep he hurled himself. This makes me so upset every time I think about it. He hurled himself on top of to protect her body from the police shooting. And then she screamed and he woke up. That's the trauma that you're talking about. That's how deeply absorbed it is, because it's so prevalent. And the only way to be able to understand that is to have gone through something so violent that you have those kinds of trauma as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up with relative privilege. I mentioned before, I went to Ursuline Academy, but those are fears that you just have regardless of class. As a Black American, I look at my brother and I have fear around him going certain places and whether or not he's going to be profiled or something can happen to him. So it's just a very real thing that folks need to be aware of. There's so many great questions here, and I have to pick one to end with, but there is a question about the future. What do you think are the best solutions for, and this might be too difficult to answer, but some of the best solutions for police enforcement going forward, now that there's so many? What's just your opinion around everything that's happening with kind of defund the police?
Well, I'm just so grateful that somebody asked that question, because I was thinking about it today and I wanted to almost open with it, but then I thought, well, that would be hijacking the whole thing we're here to do in terms of like the outlined topic. I want to talk a little, so thank you for asking that question. I think it's critical. So in my work, I work in systems design, and I see the world in systems. And what those of us in systems design understand is that systems are self-organizing, self-perpetuating, and self-correcting. A system will continue to do what it was designed to do until an interruption is so intense that it changes the system. And that interruption has to be huge to create a change in that system. Policing in the United States was born out of slave patrol. It has not evolved that much. And that's just sort of full stop. So if we want to change police brutality in the United States, we're going to have to demolish the police. And I don't mean defund, I mean get rid of it completely, because it isn't going to change. And the laws are there to protect the system of what it was designed to do. And it's working brilliantly. I don't care how many good cops you put into the system. I don't care how many Black people you put into the system. It is a powerful 400-year-old system that isn't going to change. And to make that point, when George Floyd died, one of the police officers that was a part of that, the biracial police officer, he was part Black and part white and raised by a white mother. He had 3 adopted Black siblings. He joined the police force because he believed deeply in reform and that he could be a part of that change. 4 days in, he's participating in the murder of a Black man. I do not think that man was racist. I don't think he ever intended to be a part of something that unbelievably cruel, but the system is that incredibly powerful. So I think the police have to go away completely. And that creates, good God, that frees up a lot of money to reimagine how we keep communities safe. And here's something I will leave that conversation with. 4% nationally consistent across the country, 4% of 911 calls are for violent crimes. And we call 911 and they say, what's your emergency? And the person tells them something that's not an emergency. And then a cop who's trained for violent crime shows up. And if everything is a nail, everything gets beat over the head with a hammer, right? So if we defunded the police by 96%, we would reallocate all that money to agencies that could actually help keep communities safe. But I don't even mean defund the police. I mean like completely recreate a whole new system that's designed to protect and serve. And that is not what the police is designed to do. So God bless you, whoever asked that question. And let me get that off my chest.
Yeah, they might not have been ready for it. You were ready for that. They may not have been ready for that answer, but we could probably spend another hour just talking about that. So I appreciate you bringing your full opinion on that, because there's a lot of very different opinions on that. And so I'm sure you sparked a lot of different questions and wondering. So, and I'm seeing some amens. God bless you for that answer. So I think we only have a couple minutes left. And so I think we want to make some announcements before we end the session. So I just wanted to thank you. I'm seeing so many folks just thankful for this chat, for this talk in the chat. And thank you for bringing all your knowledge to us here today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kim. And of course, thank you, Robin, for sharing your heart with us and just some wonderful educational material here around just how we can be more personally accountable, whether we are white, people, women of color, just in general, just how to do better. And that's what really our intention has been for the summer series as a whole. So for those of you who have walked with us for all 3 sessions, thank you. To our D&I committee, to my partner in the movement, Lanasha, who's our D&I chair, our committees, and our D&I committee with strategy as well, our partners in education, our partners on the strategy committee, and most of all, thank you to the board for being exceptionally supportive of this initiative that we've done so far. Because our goal was to really help the Junior League, our members, move through the listen, learn, now what? There's a lot happening within our country, and even personally, how do we deal with that? And then how do we grapple with the history of race in Dallas, and taking those 2 topics and then seeding it now more personally within ourselves of how can we begin to put into action what we have now learned. the Junior League is born and bred of women who act. So it's one thing to see something wrong, but it's another thing to do something about it. And what Robin has shared with us tonight is that you can find a way for you to be active in this movement, regardless of your background, whether it is marching in a protest or actually responding to your Facebook family and friends if they post something crazy. So having that courage along that spectrum to do that. This is not where the conversation stops. We will continue to bring programming over the course of the year, including some focus groups to really hone in and hear from you guys. What do you want the league to continue to focus on? Over the course of the summer, we have focused on race, but D&I is so much larger than that as well. So if those are like, I'm tired of talking about race, well, it's not going away. We'll keep talking about it, but it'll be a yes and to other issues as well, whether it is issues with the LGBTQ community, accessibility, the whole spectrum, other cultures, multiculturalism, how we can just be able to deal with each other on different personality levels. DE&I is about all of that, with the ultimate goal of making sure that we create a sense of belonging first within the league, which will then breed out to our community, which hopefully will affect this great United States of America. So thank you for walking with us through this process. Now, most importantly, if you have stayed this whole 61 minutes, meeting credit, don't you? And you should get it. So on your screen, there is a QR code that you can take your phone, cut that camera on, and just zap it. It will send you to a website. There you will fill out a quick survey about this session. Only if you give 5 stars will you get credit. But no, fill out the survey, and it's very important to get your feedback. We want to know if this was helpful for you, what else see in the future, but most of all, get that meeting credit. If you attended all 3 this summer, guess what? Your 3 meeting credits for the year, done. But still come to this. We have so much programming this year, whether it's coming to a GMM, other training tracks. Stay involved and engaged in the league. Again, we cannot thank you enough for just showing up and being a part of the conversation. We know the topics have been uncomfortable at times and difficult, but most of all, we hope that it has challenged you and motivated you and propelled you to do at least one act from leaving the session on today. So with that, you have the link both in the chat and the QR code. Get that meeting credit, and definitely send your feedback to either myself or Lanasha or the Education Committee, and we read and respond to everything that we get. There is a new JLD resources page also coming out very soon, so all the wonderful books that Robin listed, in addition to the slides, will be on that page. And Robin, can you mention your upcoming session you have coming up with the cohort one more time?
Yes, it is. Are you talking about the racial equity build your personal racial equity plan? Yes, it is at workplacepeaceinstitute.com/events. I'll put it in the chat.
Please do. Yes, we had someone asking about that earlier. And Vanessa or Emily, did I miss anything?
No, thank all of y'all for coming. We just really appreciate your support in this initiative. So thank you.
Awesome. Have a great night, everyone. And remember, QR code, survey. That's how you get credit. Have a wonderful night.